The Detroit Lions squared off against the Jacksonville Jaguars in their second preseason game of the offseason. And on this game, one side of the ball showed a lot of promise, while another side definitely struggled along the way. We're going to talk about all that and more in today's Risers and Fallers. What's going on, Lions fans? Welcome to the Pride of Detroit YouTube channel. I'm Miko, and in today's video, we are once again going to highlight some of the top risers and fallers to come out of the Lions' most recent preseason game, where the Lions dropped this one to the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, like I said, this video is really to highlight the players coming out of this game that really performed well and some of the players that didn't perform as well, and we're basically going to break them up into categories of risers and fallers, or if it's better for you, you can look at it as trending up and trending down. With that said, let's start with the first riser I have on this list as somebody that definitely impressed me coming out of today's game. And that player is Jack Campbell. Campbell was the Lions' 18th overall pick in this most recent draft, and it was a pick that not a lot of people were on board with at the start. Mainly because, he was a linebacker, and linebacker isn't considered a premium position. And ever since then, Jack has seemed to be on a mission to prove that he is absolutely worth that pick and has done so both in training camp and in the preseason. In fact, last week, he was the Lions' highest graded player according to PFF. And going into this week, he looked like a player that was actually showcasing a level of consistency, being able to play just about everywhere on the field when looking at how he was stopping the run, and even showed a few good drops in coverage as well. Specifically, when I talk about his drops in coverage, I know this play specifically gets credited to James Houston as a sack. But if you look at how well Jack is able to comfortably drop into his zone and kind of mirror where the quarterback's eyes is going, this is one of those types of things where it's a little detail that helps fuel a bigger play that James Houston is able to clean up later in this sack. Plays like this from Jack Campbell show that the moment isn't too big for him and that he's actually able to take what he's learning in the classroom or learning in practices and translate them onto the field. Again, Jack is someone that I know I was personally high on once I actually got a chance to dive into his tape and see what he does well. And when it comes to stuff like this, like when we're talking about dropping in coverage or seeing how well he's able to just kind of sift through the trash of a defensive and offensive line and still make tackles in the run game, these are the things that make you feel confident that, you know what, Jack Campbell's going to get on the field sooner than later. And again, he's going to have to go over the likes of Alex Anzalone and even Derek Barnes, who have both played well in training camp as well. But if Jack keeps stacking up great performances like this, in today's game, he had 7 total tackles, with 4 of those being solos. Yeah, those are the kind of performances that are going to get you opportunities with the starting lineup. Maybe again, not in week 1, but at some point in time, Jack Campbell's going to be out there with the starting lineup. Now, while Campbell was very impressive during his time on the field, I can't say the same for the Lions offensive line. And this goes for the second team and the third team. Overall, the Lions offensive line really struggled to hold up against the Jacksonville Jaguars and gave up multiple pressures and weren't able to get a lot of push in the run game at either. In fact, the Lions only totaled 35 rushing yards for the entire game. And that's just not good enough. Not necessarily when we're talking about obviously the starting caliber, because clearly these are not the guys that we're expecting to see on Sundays once the regular season starts. But when Dan Campbell talks about looking for depth or talks about the fact that no one from this group has really separated himself, today's game really highlights that. This group was giving up pressures from just about everywhere, whether it was the middle, whether it was the left side, whether it was the right side. And it was really kind of hard to, really point out one player that was playing exceptionally well on this offensive line between the two units. Now, again, if I probably went back and rewatched this tape and really deep dove into the offensive line play, I'm sure I can find a player or two that actually really held up well. But when you just look at the overall consistency of this unit, they made it really hard for the offense to function at all. And as you're going to see from the rest of this list, there are other players that suffered greatly from the fact that the offensive line just wasn't able to play well. So while the offensive line lands in my fallers category, this next player is definitely a riser for me, and that is Starling Thomas the fifth. Now, Starling Thomas was playing both corner and kick returner during today's preseason game. And while he did have a couple struggles here or there in the passing game as a corner, he absolutely shined as a returner. And with the Lions no longer having Justin Jackson to do kick returns, there have been questions around the fan base of like, hey, who's going to handle this responsibility now? And with Maurice Alexander injured for this preseason game, this opened up the door for others to get opportunities, and Thomas was the first one to get the first crack at it. And he really impressed with it, getting 66 kick return yards off of 2 returns. And he did. He looked explosive. He looked like he had the speed and he looked like he had the vision. Now, while Starling Thomas's play at corner has been the thing that has gotten a lot of people to believe that he could make this roster, his play as a kick returner could be the thing that solidifies it. Again, it's only the second preseason game, and we'll have to see if he gets more opportunities as Maurice Alexander gets healthy. But if he does, Starling Thomas is definitely one to keep an eye on as a riser and probably as a lock for this roster. Now, going back to a part of this team that was actually trending in the wrong direction, I got to highlight the Lions' run defense because the Lions' offensive line wasn't the only one that was kind of struggling in this game. The Lions' defensive line gave up 144 rush yards. And I'm sorry, there's no way you can cut it. That's just not good enough. Because unlike the offensive line, where you can probably say, like, hey, some of these guys probably won't play except for injury, this defensive line rotates a lot of bodies. And when you look at specifically the interior of this defensive line, that's where a lot of the rotation is going to come from with the likes of Bugs, Martin, Benito Jones, Christian Covington, and Levi Onwuzurike. Those guys are going to be flip flopping out throughout the regular season. So you want to be able to see that those guys can be stout in the middle. And during this preseason game, it wasn't very much the case. Now, the edges was a little bit different. But as far as the middle of this defensive line, the Lions were giving up quite a few chunk plays. And again, that's just not something that you're going to want to see if you're Aaron Glenn, because as you go into the regular season, the ability to stop the run is going to be drastically important so that you can set up those third and longs or third and manageable situations so that your secondary can do what they do best. Speaking of the Lions secondary, that leads me into my next riser, and that being cornerback Stephen Gilmore. Now, Gilmore's day didn't start off the best as he gave up a 48-yard bomb to Tim Jones that really set up the Jaguars with an opportunity to score. But he really got it together right after that, having perfect pass coverage against a play that was designed for a score, and then not too many plays later, getting a pick set up by a pass deflection from Tracy Walker. Stephen Gilmore is another one of those UDFAs that has been in a tough camp battle with the likes of Starling Thomas, Chase Lucas, and some of the other cornerbacks that are looking to try to make this roster. And with performances like today, not just the pick, but the fact of doing what Dan Campbell kind of highlighted during his halftime press conference to showcase, look, yes, I'm a rookie, but I also have a short-term memory and I can go out here and still make plays even after getting beat deep. I'm not sure how likely it is that Stephen Gilmore and Starling Thomas both make this roster as UDFAs, but play like this continuing throughout training camp and throughout the regular season could put the Lions in a tough decision when it comes down to choosing who they want to make this final 53. Now, one player that's kind of making the Lions' job easy as far as determining what they're going to do with the final 53, specifically at the quarterback position, is Nate Sudfeld. Once again, Nate Sudfeld threw another interception, which is his third of the preseason. And it once again came on a similar type of play of him just not being able to make these deeper throws accurately. And much like last week, where yes, some of the blame does have to be put on the offensive line and not giving quarterbacks like Nate Sudfeld and Teddy Bridgewater opportunities to find success, Nate Sudfeld is kind of just putting together two back-to-back poor performances, which continues to have him in my faller category. Now, despite that being the case, I do want to give Nate some credit because he is the reason that they got their only touchdown of the day, finding Chase Cota in the end zone. And if it's not for some precise throwing by Nate on that drive, the Lions never get that opportunity. But still, you can't have a backup quarterback or someone vying for the QB2 position that can't protect the football. And right now, that is the biggest issue that Nate is having to deal with. And right now, that's the biggest problem that Nate has to deal with. And speaking of a problem, that leads me right into my next riser, being James Houston. James had a phenomenal game. And after last week, where that game was heavily dominated by the Aquaras, James Houston came out here and proved that, you know what? He still very much should be in consideration for making this roster and should probably still be in the lead for making this roster when we talk about having that final edge spot. Houston wasn't just effective in the pass game. He actually showed a good amount of growth in run defense and in being able to drop in coverage and then come up out of coverage to be able to make tackles in the backfield. In fact, James had 4 tackles for loss, which is a huge improvement when you look at where his game was last year, where again, primarily a pass rusher, but is now showing the ability to understand how to play against the run. And for those of us who are a huge supporter of James Houston and want to see him be successful, these are the types of things that he's going to have to continue to do. It's not the pass rushing. We know he can do that. But can you defend the run? Can you drop in coverage? And in today's game, the answer to that was yes. Now, for my last fallers on this list, I'm actually going to put these two players together because they were both pretty disappointing in my eyes, and that being Trinity Benson and wide receiver Dylan Drummond. Now, both of these guys are vying to make this roster as once again as a wide receiver 5 or wide receiver 6 spot. And both of these guys had really bad drops that really could hurt them in the terms of being able to make this roster. And more so in the case of Benson than Drummond, because Drummond did still have a couple catches and did still show the ability to be relied upon in the passing game. But in terms of Trinity Benson, he was targeted 3 times and didn't make any of those receptions. In the case of Drummond, he was targeted 5 times and only made 2 receptions. We've already talked about how poor the offensive line and the quarterback play was today. So, yes, that's part of the reason why I'm not going to be too hard on both of these players, but it's still worth them being on this part of the list because the drops that these guys had were drops that you just shouldn't have if you're looking to make a roster. For example, Trinity Benson had an over the shoulder pass from Teddy Bridgewater that literally just went through his arms. And again, Benson has missed too much practice to be letting these opportunities slip through his hands. No pun intended. And Drummond, like I said, is really just on this list because it's just a step back from the performances that he's been having. And at this point, while he's done a lot of good things in training camp and has had some good performances even in that Giants game, we need to see that level of play show up during these actual preseason games so that the coaches know how to properly evaluate him. Because if both of these players aren't careful, the likes of Chase Cota and Antoine Green could be the 2 wide receivers that get the final spot on this 53-man roster. And last but not least, my final riser from today's preseason game has to go to defensive end John Cominsky. For me, Comish is someone that has just truly elevated his game from where it was last year. And he didn't make my list last week because of how impressive Julian Okwara was. But even in last week's game against the Giants, Cominsky showed the ability to really get into the backfield and blow up run games and also be that type of player that forces quarterbacks into tough decisions and tough situations that could eventually lead to sacks. Now, if you look at the stat sheet, you're not going to see numbers that are overly impressive, but if you did watch this game, you will see someone that is absolutely the type of player that this defensive line is going to need. And if you start comparing that level of play and that level of effort with more talented players in the likes of Aiden Hutchinson and Charles Harris and an opportunistic secondary, this defense starts to look much more intimidating than it did a season ago. So guys, that's going to do it for today's video. Once again, it's worth keeping in mind that these are preseason games. And while it would be much more pleasant to see this team win every opportunity they got, it's important to keep in mind that these games are set up for evaluations. And that's all this list is, and that's all these games are. So yes, you can be disappointed in certain players. You can be disappointed in certain position groups, but understand that everything that is happening between now and before the season starts is all helping to get this team better so that they can actually do the number one thing that matters once the regular season kicks off. And that's win and show themselves to be capable of competing for a championship. So with all that said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, let me know in the comment section below. Let me know if there's anybody that you would have on this list as a riser or a faller from your perspective. And also, if there's any more information that you're looking on from this game or about the Lions in general, please be sure to head over to prideofdetroit.com where you can find any of the latest articles and updates from not just this game, but any other things going on about the Lions going forward. Also, if you're new to this channel, please be sure to hit the subscribe button and hit that notification bell. That way you can be notified every time we upload a brand new video. Once again, everybody, I'm Miko here at Pride of Detroit. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.